Okay, thank you very much for that, Mandy. We'll let you go, and we'll crack on with Dr. Zhang, who's going to talk next about deep sea mining. Dr. Kung, sorry, Anthony, I see you're online there. A fascinating topic. I'm looking forward to hearing. So we'll let you crack onto it. We can see your presentation. Thanks.
Great. Can you see me and hear me as well?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I'm aware that I am standing between you and lunch, so I will try as quickly as possible to keep us on time. The presentation today is about deep sea mining, but also there's a quick update on the social performance diagnostic work that's also funded by the Complex Ore Bodies program. So I wanted to hijack that for hijack this position to give a quick update as well. I just want to check if that slide has changed. I'm going to assume so.
Yep.
Good. So in September, for those who were there, I presented an SMI webinar on this, so I wouldn't spend too much time on background. But through the Complex Ore Bodies program, we developed an approach to assessing how companies organize themselves for social performance. This is a continuation of a number of Complex Ore Bodies projects. In this one, the question is how companies' social performance functions, whether the function is fit for purpose. And that is effectively a three-part design. First, we figure out what the purpose is. Then we have a look at what the function currently is and how it works. And then we work with the company to position them better for social performance. And this is effectively a handover of responsibility to the company. Within these three areas, there are components of research, and for more information, I guess there's the YouTube webinar. If you like that video, don't forget to like and subscribe, etc. I'm joking. The updates that I wanted to give were that since that webinar, and at the time we had been commissioned by an international mining company to apply this work to their company. So that's been a substantial bit of funding for us to do that. That also, subsequent to that commission, our preliminary results were so exciting, or so we were told, that we were invited to directly engage with company executives. And that's a really exciting milestone for this project. This was outside of the original scope, but it does indicate an ability to influence at the highest levels of companies. We've since also had interest from another major company to commission a similar scope of work. And multiple companies mean that we do have a pathway for novel academic work by putting those findings together. So as far as the main agenda item for today, I'll just check the time. On deep sea mining, this is really about a paper that was recently accepted, and you can see there that it's written by myself and my colleagues Camilla, Eleanor, Rick, Diana, John. This was accepted into the Journal of Environmental Management. In this presentation, I want to do three things. I want to spend quite a bit of time on context for those not familiar with developments in the deep sea mining space. And, I only myself have optics on a small part of it. Then I want to summarize our paper briefly. And then I want to describe what's next for this line of thinking. So for those who are unfamiliar, deep sea mining research dates back to at least the 1960s. There are three types of deposits. They're polymetallic nodules, ferromanganese crusts, and seafloor massive sulfides. The nodules are a source of manganese and iron, as well as nickel, copper, cobalt, rare earths, lithium, a lot of other of those smaller minerals, smaller in proportion. Cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts are cobalt-rich, also manganese iron as well, nickel, copper, titanium. Seafloor massive sulfides, high sulfide content, obviously, but also rich in copper, zinc, gold, silver, and some other metals. Where are they located? They are located in the ocean. And I want to draw your attention particularly to the Pacific, which is where most of the attention on deep sea mining is at the moment. The places that are pushing most for deep sea mining are the Cook Islands within their domestic waters, the national waters, and an area in international waters called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the middle of the Pacific. That's governed by the International Seabed Authority. We'll come back to these when we come to describe the paper. It's important to know that there is no current commercial mining. The closest we got was the Nautilus Minerals Solwara 1 project, which was granted a commercial license in 2011, but that company has since gone bankrupt and commercial extraction never started. There has been a lot of recent attention to deep sea minerals despite interest starting in the 1960s. What's driving it partly is demand for metals. So we know from the Global Material Resources Outlook, as well as recent academic work, that demand for metals is projected to increase significantly. We know that as there is more attention on climate change, that renewable energy is also going to drive demand for metals. And we know from earlier this morning that renewable energy demands for metals is likely to drive ESG risks. So this is this paper also intersects with quite a lot of work in the Complex Ore Bodies program, such as this. So we are familiar with the ideas here that mining is pushing into areas that carry ESG risk, environmental, social, and governance risks, as shown in this paper and this paper by our colleagues here in the program. So deep sea mining has emerged as a potential source of metals. So this is a very recent paper published in Nature Reviews Earth and Environment, making the claim that within the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, that's the zone that's in international waters in the Pacific, the nodules there are estimated to have a greater tonnage of a bunch of metals than the entire global terrestrial reserve base. So there is an enormous amount of interest in accessing those resources. The industry itself is promoting a message on ESG. This paper that you see on screen there is an industry-funded piece of research suggesting that there's lower global warming potential by switching to marine sources of metals. There's less land disturbance generally, lower social impact, and they were unclear about the impact on biodiversity. And this lack of certainty is something that we'll pick up on in our paper. It is the deep sea minerals prospect is very controversial, and it's controversial for three main reasons. The first reason is the commercial failure of the Solwara 1 project left PNG with $100 million odd of debt, and that spooked a lot of countries that would otherwise have supported it. The unknown environmental risk is something that has been picked up in the academic literature for quite some time now. And of course, the deep sea is a bit of a frontier with lots of uncertainty as to what's down there and how mining would affect it. And there has been a lot of international high-profile attention on this. So David Attenborough serves on the board of an NGO called Fauna and Flora International, who recently released a report which supports a moratorium on deep sea mining as a matter of policy. And he's come out and in support of that message as well. And given his profile, that's grabbed attention around the world. In domestic circles, domestic politics in the Pacific, so Fiji last year called for a 10-year moratorium, and this was after the collapse of the Papua New Guinea project. At the same time, the Cook Islands has as of a couple of weeks ago, you can see the date there is the 23rd of October, has just opened applications for exploration. So we have this sort of tension happening in the Pacific. Part of what's driving that, and this is, the Cook Islands' interest predates COVID. Part of what's driving that is the desire for development. The Cook Islands is heavily dependent on tourism, and I think COVID has exposed the risks of an economy that is so dependent on international travel. So all of those pieces together forms a background to our paper. The piece basically is that deep sea mining looks really attractive as a source of metals. We're not sure what the environmental impacts are, but there is a lot of pressure both for and against in various circles. Just quickly check the time. What I want to do here is highlight is to give an overview of the paper. The objective of the paper is to look at emerging regulations in the International Seabed Authority, as well as in the Cook Islands, and really question whether they reflect the complexities of deep sea mining. So we're thinking of deep sea mining as a type of complex ore body. There's two broad parts to our paper. One is a spatial overlay analysis, and the second is a look at the regulations. The spatial overlay analysis looked at the areas that you see on the right-hand side there. I am conscious of time and the need to keep to the schedule, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. But the main point there was to look at these areas, which Rick and Elinor and others within this complex ore bodies program has looked, and to think through that kind of analysis for deep sea mining. And the key point there was that the risk profile, the environmental, social, and governance risk profile for deep sea mining is difficult to compile at the moment. It requires data that isn't available, and it's not available with respect to both the receiving environment, in other words, what is underneath the ocean 5 kilometers deep, as well as the extractive technologies to be used. So given that there is no current commercial extraction of deep sea mining, there's no precedent to base assessment of environmental impacts on. This is an example of one of the outputs produced in this paper, with thanks particularly to Camilla on this one. This is an overlay of the location of deep sea deposits and marine protected areas. And you can see there that the Cook Islands marine protected areas overlaps with all of its deep sea deposits. There's a particular reason for that, and that's because a few years ago, the Cook Islands enacted legislation that made all of its waters into a marine park, and then other uses are carved out of that. But this shows that there is a real concern that deep sea mining will impact on areas that are that there's a reason for its protection. So what we're highlighting here is that we don't know much about deep sea mining, we don't know much about the deep sea, but what we do know suggests that there does at least need to be greater attention on those interactions. So is that attention being given or reflected in the regulations? And what we found by looking at the ISA regulations, the International Seabed Authority regulations, and the recent Cook Islands Seabed Minerals Bill, is that largely those regulations aren't dealing with the unique complexities of deep sea mining in any great detail. What we see is an importation of terrestrial mining governance architectures, as well as references to things like best environmental practices that aren't defined and certainly reflect the uncertainty that those legislatures are grappling with. And of course, we're not suggesting any blame or shortfall. I think is really the main thing really is that there is such a degree of complexity that governance is very difficult. An example of how terrestrial mining governance architectures don't fit really well with deep sea mining is environmental impact assessment. So both of those regulations demand or require proponents to undertake an assessment of environmental impacts. But that methodology is difficult to apply when your baseline data of what's currently going on is so scarce. So what's next for us? This paper has been the result of some earlier engagement with the Cook Islands. So I wrote this, reviewed a draft of the Seabed Minerals Bill in the Cook Islands. There has been some interest diplomatically from the New Zealand government in supporting the Cook Islands investigation into deep sea mining. I know that Professor Salim Ali has been engaging with the International Seabed Authority, and there is a bit of a divide in our attentions there. Simply because we're interested in different things. There's potential for research collaborations within UQ. I think that there has been some, I'm not sure if Nick covered this earlier today, but some potential for work with the law school on further development of regulations in the Pacific. And of course, if you listen to Nick's presentation, there's a crossover with just transitions research. In other words, looking at the transitions to low carbon economies and the effect on the Pacific. I hope that's been a whirlwind overview. I hope that's sufficient to start a conversation. This is very early in our investigations, and I'd be really pleased to engage further. And I hope I've clawed back some time, not too much. Thanks, Paul and Rick.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. Yeah, that's fascinating. You did claw back a little bit of time, so I think we maybe see if there's any questions for you for any of the other speakers that missed out on questions. Are there any questions here in the room for Anthony? Not at the moment. None online at the moment, Rick. Well, in that case, while we're waiting, we will just have a quick whip around. I think it was Daniel, Nick, and Philip both didn't have time for questions. So if there are any for those, if they're still online, if I could just ask you to stop sharing your screen, Anthony, that would be great. Thanks. And if those guys are still online, are there any questions for Nick, Daniel, or Philip from the room here? Oh, there's one here.
Hello, Philip. Thanks for your great talk. I am curious about the mechanism of metal absorption for those hyperaccumulators, and what differs these plants from the non-tolerant plants.
Thank you for the question. Yeah. So what the hyperaccumulator plants or the tolerant plants, they do is they normally exclude the metal from sensitive cells, like the subcellular distribution. So normally they sequester the metals into some specialized cellular components, like the vacuoles. So they are kept from the normal metabolic activities. So they protect the cells, they protect the sensitive cells, rather than normal plants just take it and they are not able to really sequester into specialized cells. So because of that, they present toxicity to normal plants, but hyperaccumulator plants have specialized mechanisms that enable them to really sequester. That's why I said there will be a follow-up experiment at the synchrotron to really study the subcellular distribution, so that we can say that, oh, they are like sequestered in the vacuoles, they are sequestered in the epidermis, or they are, so that they have special mechanisms that are able to sequester the metals in very specialized cells, so they don't allow the metals to move around.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I'll be looking forward to those results. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Susanna. Philip, is there anybody else with some questions for Anthony, Nick, or Philip, who are here on screen? Oh, there's one more here.
Hi, Philip. Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to know how deep these plants can extract these materials, and if you have seen any movement upwards of these materials because of the plant?
Yes, we've seen subsoil replenishment of depleted topsoil metal. Normally, we target the first 1 meter of the soil, but when the topsoil metal is depleted, we are able to like turn over the soil, like harrowing, just like in normal agriculture. And when we turn over this soil, we are able to recycle, let the subsoil really come up so that the plants could have access to these metals. Yep, so we normally target 1 to 2 meters, but if there is any, if the depth is high, we can just recycle by just turning the soil. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Philip. And well, Rick has a question here.
Is that working? Yeah. Actually, well, I had a couple really. For Anthony first. So that I hadn't heard that I hadn't seen that news about the Cook Islands actually sort of pulling the trigger on allowing exploration. Have they actually have they released any detail on how they plan to regulate? Are they going to use the International Seabed Authority regulations, or have they developed their own? Or
yeah, they've developed their own regulations. I haven't had a really close look at whether there's been new regulations on exploration specifically. Part of that reason is you have to purchase legislation from the Cook Islands. It's not freely available, and I haven't looked, and that announcement was really recent. I do know the Act has a section on exploration, but if I just consult my memory, I don't think it's particularly detailed. I think it has the same shortcomings that I outlined in the presentation, that there's lots of emphasis on the G, on issuing licenses, and corporate, as a regulation of corporations, but not so much on the environmental and social side.
thanks. I had one for Nick too, but does anyone else have one?
I had one for you as well, but you go first.
I was just, you probably said this, but I lost track a little bit. Is there an outcome you have in mind for the just transitions research, or a set of? I'm just trying to think. Is there a goal in terms of understanding or changes in company behavior or government policy, or yeah, that's the question really. What's first prize look like in this research?
Yeah, I think it's a very fruitful concept to try and work with, and so the intention is to try and carry the research forward. The objective of that, or at least one objective, I think, is to understand, could the idea of just transition provide the basis for a governance framework for extraction? And that's an unknown at this stage. So that's the exploratory dimension to it. What would it look like if we started to apply this concept in its fullest sense? What would that look like in terms of a governance framework? What would it do for current governance frameworks? How could it then change practice? What would be the implications of actually carrying this through? And I think that's the next stage for this research program.
Thanks.
Thanks. And I'll take the opportunity one more, Nick, while you're there. One of your slides seemed to be implying that the oil and gas sector was somewhat ahead of the mining industry in terms of looking at just transitions. And you did show one quote, I think it was from Anglo American. Are other companies in the mining industry sort of taking this on board, or is that just a single anomalous quote, do you think?
So we found 3 quotes from 3 different companies. And the way in which they're all using the term in a similar sense, either to position themselves as essential for a transition, to say, look, we're not going to transition without mining, therefore we're front and center for any transition activities, or in relation to coal, transitioning out of coal, so like what we've seen with Anglo. I think it serves as a bit of a, I won't say smoke screen, but potentially it does obfuscate things a little bit, because on the one hand, companies can be saying, well, look, we're doing these things as part of our contribution to a just transition, and and in this case, divesting from coal, and that's what we're saying a just transition is about. But it doesn't mean that coal is being taken off the market, and doesn't mean they're not selling to somebody else, or that there's some other less scrupulous operator who will pick up these mines and continue to mine coal. So I think that's why it's important to be looking at who's using it and how are they using this term, what's it being used to justify, and then what's it potentially overlooking as a result of that.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Nick. One last chance if anybody has any more questions for the speakers who are up there on the board.
Could I ask Anthony a question?
Go on.
So Anthony, so we know about Cook Islands legislation. When the Solar Water Run project was being put up in PNG, did they operate, was that going to operate under existing mining legislation, so terrestrial legislation, or were they proposing something separate for that?
To my knowledge, it was under the existing framework in PNG.